We are continuing our study of Sri Aurobindo's description of the relationship between soul and nature. The whole of the problem of life rests upon the resolution of this relationship, and it rests on this one question: what are we to do with this soul and nature set face to face with each other? And he describes in detail what that nature of the relationship is. While nature is trying to impress itself upon the soul to possess, control and determine it, the soul, that is our own awareness standing back from our nature, feels in some mysterious way that it has a freedom, a control over itself, a responsibility for what it is and does, and tries therefore to turn upon nature, to control, possess and enjoy it. And if it cannot, then it tries to reject or escape from nature. And this whole drama is taking place not only in the individual soul and our individual nature, but also at a level which is of the world. Nature itself is individual, and the world, soul also, as we will see, has something larger behind. But for the moment, at our individual experience of the soul, I am conscious as the soul. We struggle with our own nature and with the larger nature which hits us in our environment, in our circumstances. And here we are trying to somehow get back our sense of freedom and control. In that sense of freedom and control, we feel we are responsible both for ourselves and for this larger nature. And so we turn upon all this and try to control, possess or enjoy. And failing that, we have a tendency to reject and escape. Now this description is so profound because remember, he is describing the problem of our existence itself in this question. What are we to do with these two? We can also view this in the journey of an individual's life. From the time you are born as a little baby, driven by an instinct, instinctively we have the sense that we can control our environment. We discover very quickly how we do that. Each time we cry, suddenly the food comes, the caress comes, the comfort comes. So you cry and gain it. And as it becomes more and more conscious and developed in its tools, the manner of controlling the environment becomes more and more sophisticated. There is an experience every parent has faced of the child manipulating them, manipulating one against the other, blackmailing them through emotional or other means. And these are all skills that instinctively we develop as a way of controlling so that we may possess and gain a security and through that enjoy it better. This is finally the driving tendency. I remember a child at the age of 10 or 11 had been watching very carefully the dynamics of the household. Now this was a large family. Parents were there were many relatives, there were servants, big household. And then one day, as he is going to school with his father, he asks, "Papa, who can do the setting for mum? Now, setting is a term which is used in politics or in business. You set your environment so that you get things favorable to you. So, for example, it will be said that when you do a setting with the business, means you've bribed everybody. So now the thing will work in your favor. You've done a setting with the government, you've bribed everybody, things will go in your favor. In politics, you've done a setting, so you know the outcome already in advance. So this child asks, and he has got the vocabulary and the idea of setting. And he asks, Dad, who can do the setting of mom? He realized that in the entire machinery of his environment, his mother had the maximum control over everything. And he could not somehow get through to get her to do what he wanted. And he needed to know who he can utilize or what power he can bring in to do a setting with his mother. I can see how the rational mind beginning to kick in, it takes on a very specific form, but it is the same tendency. And then we see how this becomes more complex as we enter into a society. But eventually in life, and it happens to everybody at some time or other, you find that in trying to control your environment, nature pushes back. She pulls you in, she reels you in to get you to develop your capacities, offering you promises, giving you hopes, giving you dreams, so that you may chase after them, and in so doing, develop yourself. This is a very important idea. If from the beginning you have been told no, 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 you become passive and lose motivation. If at each step you are encouraged and enthused to gain whatever it is you are chasing after, then you grow, and once nature has pulled you into the mold that she wants, or drawn out from you the maximum, then she starts nibbling on the edges, and then she starts cutting down. And suddenly now things don't go the way I want. I'm unable to control the way I used to. My dreams, which were so accessible and I thought I would do them in 5 or 10 years, now are receding, becoming more and more difficult, or even impossible, and so on. Until at some point, if you're fortunate, nature pushes really hard and you realize you cannot. And that's when the second instinct kicks in. If I cannot control, possess and enjoy, then I will reject and withdraw and escape. And this is what happens often, celebrated in many of the ascetic traditions. And mother, of course, was very sharply against these things. Somebody approached saying, Mother, now I have developed a disgust of life. I want to join the ashram, I have retired. No, sorry, no place for you here. Very simple answer. Sri Aurobindo has a series of letters criticizing this position of helplessness, which is so celebrated in the ascetic tradition, because they say, now you have been beaten down by life, now you're ready for the spiritual life, separate from the world. And Sri Aurobindo shows you that yes, perhaps it is useful for the ascetic tendency, because now you're so disgusted with life that it won't pull you back. But for our purpose, in the integral yoga where you want to master and manifest divinity, you want to master nature, then for that purpose, he says, you do need to disengage, but the poise of the Bhagavad Gita to develop equality in all things and in all relations, that is a superior poise, rather than the poise of disgust to turn away from the world. So this is how Sri Aurobindo has described this relationship and its complexity. And then he says, the whole of human philosophy, religion and science is only an attempt to get the right data upon which this solution can be found. And we see very interestingly, in the solution itself Sri Aurobindo offers, he says we have to recognize that there are 2 levels of nature. Equally, there are 2 levels of the soul and its relationship with nature. And that's when you get the insight. There is a lower level where soul is more dominated by nature. There is a higher level where soul leads nature, is even one on a still higher level. Of this, once we have this glimpse, which is what we are now reading, we look back at his reference of human philosophy, religion and science, and see how they approach this problem. Science largely basing itself on the physical reality of nature and the very limited sense of awareness we have in our body consciousness as an individual, science naturally concludes that your individuality, the soul, is a product of nature and therefore entirely determined by nature. Philosophy takes a higher position, more intermediate between the highest and the scientific. It approaches through the mind, logically maps out the various possible combinations of relationships, recognizes that there appears to be something like a real free will, even as there is this powerful conditioning of nature and the struggle between the two. And then depending on the tilt of the philosopher, it swings one way or the other. A classic example is of Amal Kiran, K.D. Setna in the ashram, who was a man of brilliant intellect and philosopher. He even declared that his mind is Greek, although his body is Indian. And in his studies, even after having read Sri Aurobindo, the mind could not come to a final conclusion. That's the nature of the mind. At some stage you have to step beyond to an experience. But well, having read and understood all this, all the arguments, still his mind was in doubt. And so he went to the mother and he said, "Mother, I have read everything. Tell me once and for all, is there or is there not free will? Just tell me yes or no, don't give me the in-between stuff." And mother said, "Yes." And so there is free will, and that was it. He said, "Okay, now I don't need to have any more discussion." But this is the problem of philosophy, that since it primarily builds on thinking, rational speculation, it ends up with this, always a doubt. Religion takes a position which attempts to explore the higher relation between the liberated soul and perhaps lower nature or a liberated nature, depending on the religion itself. And there is always this affirmation of the essential freedom of the soul. Even in the Buddhist, nihilistic Buddhism, which considers everything to emerge from an emptiness and a return to the emptiness as the solution, recognizes that you have within you innate the power to stand back and get free. Meaning that is finally implied as the idea that finally soul is greater than nature. And it builds itself upon certain deeper experiences, although the format of the religious teaching may or may not satisfy philosophy and science. But we see how these three have their place, and in human evolution, they each fulfill a certain domain of experience. When again and again we are called to accept matter, science dominates. When we are called to develop our intellect, philosophy dominates. When nature turns to push forward once again a spiritual or an intuitive awakening, religion tends to dominate. When religion distances itself too much from matter or abandons matter, once again nature pushes back to either philosophy or science, and so on. Between the three, they assist in developing different levels of our being. So, this now leads us to Sri Aurobindo's quick summary of what builds for us the basic data that will lead to the resolution of the problem. The hope of a complete escape from our present strife with the subjection to our lower and troubled nature and existence arises when we perceive what religion and philosophy affirm, but modern thought has tried to deny. So we have hope that we can get free from the limitations of our nature when we recognize this truth, that there are two poises of our soul existence: a lower, troubled and subjected; a higher, supreme, untroubled and sovereign. So when we say soul, our first experience is I who am conscious. But even this conscious is shifting. I am sometimes less conscious or more conscious. And then I have these occasional exalted states where I am as if in some extraordinary thing which I cannot somehow sustain, and I fall back. And we recognize that there are levels between which this awareness is able to shift. In the higher, supreme, untroubled and sovereign. And we find this when faced with a crisis in life, in our circumstances, when we feel most helpless, most overwhelmed, as if everything seems to go wrong and we feel as if the whole point and meaning of life is lost, we feel depressed. Occasionally we have these flashes of clarity when suddenly you feel liberated, uplifted and say, oh, it's not a problem anymore. I understand what it is. I see where it is going. I can deal with it. And then again the consciousness falls and you find yourself trapped in this. And you will notice this shift of up and down, although the scale of it may not be the same, this shift of up and down has many cycles. There is at the very least a daily cycle. When you wake up from sleep, you are most close to the subconscious, because mostly our sleep tends to be subconscious. Even if a part of our consciousness enters into higher states, the body consciousness tends to enter a subconscious state. And when you wake up, you are most dull. And often that's the time when you are most overwhelmed with a sense of helplessness. As the day proceeds, the bright sun rises, your consciousness tends to be lifted, and at some point it feels, yes, I can do. Whatever the difficulty, I know I can overcome. And then again there is a decline. So there's a vertical drift up and down which is daily. There is interestingly also a seasonal drift. Not so obvious in the tropics, but when you go to closer to the poles, the seasonal drift can become quite obvious, and it's tied to the position or the brightness of the sun. When the sun is not so bright or the hours of light are less, the mind tends to become more negative and more introverted in a passive or negative way during those periods, and so on. And then there are cycles which span the whole journey of life, which varies with people, but which are often attempted to be mapped by astrological or other means. But we recognize that there is this fluctuation of consciousness having its own rhythms. And as a result, our relationship with nature also tends to change, depending on what level we are at. Either we are more free, more untroubled and sovereign, or we find ourselves again lower, subjected, troubled and bound. The difference between these two is of consciousness. So he says, one vibrant in mind, the other tranquil in spirit. Now Sri Aurobindo's vocabulary very suggestive. Mind has a vibrancy, because in mind we are engaged. In spirit there is the calm tranquility. We automatically feel ourselves aloof, or at least free. The engagement is not so strong. The hope not only of an escape, but of a completely satisfying and victorious solution comes when we perceive what some religions and philosophies affirm, but others seem to deny, that there is also in the dual unity of soul and nature a lower, an ordinary human status, and a higher, a divine, in which the conditions of the duality are reversed, and the soul becomes that which now it only struggles and aspires to be. So just as the soul has its levels, its relationship with nature also shifts. And once you accept this, then you discover that he uses the phrase dual unity of the soul. Soul and nature are always inseparable, but their duality also exists. But in this relationship of dual unity, there is also a double level, an ordinary human status and a higher divine. Lower nature gives you what is human status, and in the human status you are subject. There is no questioning that. In the other status, what happens? A divine in which the condition of the duality are reversed, and the soul becomes that which it now only struggles and aspires to be. Master of its nature, free. So this is what we are struggling to do. We gain that in the divine relationship, master of nature and freedom. And at that point you have your mastery over your individual nature. Whatever happens to your body, you are not conditioned by it. You can freely act irrespective of the body's condition. And also, you can determine how the body or the mind or your emotions act. So freedom is one status where you are no more affected. Mastery is the other side of the status where you can impact upon and change the response. This is at an individual level. And then further beyond that, and by union with the divine, possessor also of the world nature. If at that point your consciousness widens to unite with the divine, then in that divine relation with nature you have the whole cosmos, which is also your space, your nature. So we'll look at a few examples of this. The most obvious which come to mind are in relationship to body and pain of body. In the life of Ramana Maharshi, there is this incident where he had a cancer tumor on his elbow, and the doctors insisted on operating. And he said, yes, you can operate, but no anesthetic will be required. So he gives his arm and the doctor does the surgery. And he is fully conscious and as calm as always. And the disciple asks him, sir, aren't you suffering? His response, there is pain but no suffering. Very clearly the duality is seen. Pain belongs to the body consciousness. You cut it, well, there will be pain. Suffering is part of your psychological response to the pain or other circumstance. And so, no suffering. How does he do that? Because he, in his higher poise, the soul having its status as divine consciousness, can shape the status of the mind and the emotions freely. It is not dependent on them. If that mastery had been extended all the way to the physical body, it could even have changed the response of the body. But for his life's mission, that was not necessary, and that was not, at least obviously, developed. Sri Aurobindo, on the other hand, because his mission included the body consciousness and its divinization and transformation, he describes how, even in the most extreme pain, in the impact on the body, he was able to transform the nature of the body's experience. In the Record of Yoga, which is of his personal diary notes, he describes how at a certain stage, he is able to walk in the middle of the day in midsummer at noon. Now, noon in Pondicherry, you have to recognize, is a very hot period in midsummer. Temperatures can easily hit 40 degrees centigrade. At that point, it used to be the roads had tar. The tar begins to boil. If you put your foot on it, if the tar is loose, your foot actually sinks in. The tar sticks. You can see bubbles of the forming in the tar. Nowadays we don't have that kind of road anymore. The tar is much better bound. The loose tar is not so easily seen. But if you put your feet on stone, then the stone is hot enough that if you put a few drops of water, they evaporate within a minute or two. In such noon, Sri Aurobindo describes how he is able to walk barefoot. And the body does not experience any discomfort of pain or distress. Instead, there is a sense of a calm and a cool sensation, even a pleasant sensation. Now, this is the degree to which the body consciousness has been seized by the influence of the liberated soul in its divine status and worked upon to change its response to the heat or what would have been physical discomfort. Now you see how it works. At first, your mind is able to be free. Your body is in pain, your emotions are in distress. But your mind can stand back. Yes, I feel distressed, I feel sadness, but I can step back from the sadness, and in my mind's awareness I am free. Where did this freedom come from? Something within was able to disengage, stand back and discover that it is no more affected. And then it has been able to infuse that freedom in the mind and it's working. Then perhaps from there gradually extending into the emotions. Once my mind is clear, I am able to bring the calm and stillness into my emotions and stand back and watch the pain. And if this is possible, why not all the way? Infuse that calm and freedom into the body consciousness itself. And at first, you are aware of the body, you're aware of the sensation, but the sense of the sensation changes. No more you're suffering, oh, it's burning. You become like this calm and quiet. Yes, it is quite intense. Compared to the pain I had that time when I had that little bump, this one seems to be more. You're able to speak like that very objectively. And you are aware in the body consciousness itself of the sense of pain. And then you can push further into it a sense of calm and clarity. And gradually the sensation of pain begins to dissolve. And this is an amazing experience when it happens. Sometimes it happens within seconds when you just touch the right balance, and within seconds the sense of pain goes away. And what is there? There is sensation. You feel it, you feel the impact, but the body now translates it as something pleasant, no more painful. The habit earlier was of translating this kind of impact as painful and distressing, and all the instincts of the body kick in. But now that habit has been reshaped, and you are able to accept that, and yes, it's a different kind of experience. And that's it. The same can be done with food. You see people sometimes, there's a bit of chili in the food and they start jumping and screaming, they start drinking water, gulping helplessly, it changes nothing. And then there are people who say, that was a little intense, be careful. And then they do what is needed but not get overwhelmed by it. This can go all the way even to the sensation on the tongue where you can take or have that most intense chili. And interestingly, your eyes are watering because of the body reaction of instinct, but you are not in distress. You say, very interesting experience. But you could push it one more step and actually change that habit of the body. And as far as the integral yoga is concerned, our goal is to go all the way down, and not only into the general body consciousness and its habit, teach it to participate in the freedom of the liberated soul, but even down to the very cells, in the working of the cells, which right now we cannot even become conscious of, because it represents a level so much lower in grade of consciousness. But this is the relationship which can be reformed from the higher consciousness of a liberated soul relating to nature and assisting nature, so to say, to become liberated. And this is what we aspire to be. And this relationship is reversed in the higher status. Master of its nature, free. And by union with the divine, possessor also of the world nature. And at that point the relationship with the whole universe changes, and even circumstances around you begin to respond differently. Just as in your body, the body began to respond differently, so too in your environment there is a difference of response. Again, looking at examples in Sri Aurobindo's Record of Yoga, he discusses the natural unfoldment of the triple siddhi: Ishita, Vashita and Aishwarya. Ishita is when you choose or you wish something. I wish somebody would switch on the fan or speed it up. And spontaneously, or you put an intention, and spontaneously somebody gets up and does it. So no, in the first case, Ishita, you desire it and it happens. In Vaishita, you put out an intention, a conscious will. So and so should be able to do this. Or it can be a general will, somebody now needs to reach out and do this. Now what you have to recognize very quickly is in the working of the consciousness at the level of pure will of the mind or life energies, the sense of space and time are very fluid. So you could, for example, put out an intention and it could act at a great distance. It doesn't have to be next to you. There's one example where Sri Aurobindo is looking out from the window, and out there on the road, a mat has been laid out. And a little boy is walking by, and Sri Aurobindo puts an intention that the boy should go up to the mat. He is going in a different direction. So the intention is the boy should go up to the mat, roll it up, and place it neatly against the wall. And then he observes in his diary notes, first the boy looks at the mat and hesitates, walks up to the mat and then turns away. And Sri Aurobindo says he puts a fresh intention, and this time the boy is seized by the intention. He goes up to the mat, rolls it up, places it, and walks away. And Sri Aurobindo's observation that this kind of hesitation and non-response is typical of a tamasic nature. Now, you can see how Sri Aurobindo is experimenting in minute detail with this working, but the rationale behind it, it's not like you have to develop a special ability to project energy, project thought. That would be the training of occultism, where you have to train to project energies or intentions using various means. This, which he is describing, is the spontaneous flowering out of the capacity by the very fact that his consciousness is now connected to the universal consciousness. And at a level of the divine realization, he is one with the divine consciousness and the universe as an expression of the divine consciousness. And so when there is a need and when there is a requirement, an intention put out or even unexpressed will produce spontaneously that ripple effect. But the highest status, which is when you are entirely one with the divine and from there working, is the Aishwarya. When you have lordship. Aishwarya is the particular form of Ishvara. Aishwarya is the quality of being Ishvara, of lordship. Quality of being Lord. So you are in a consciousness which is one with the Lord, and at that point you do not have to put out a specific intention. You may not have a personal desire, but simply this is seen to be required and things start moving, often in multiple directions from multiple sources, and it happens. And nothing can resist, inevitably, because it comes from the same authority that is the creative power of the Lordship of the Divine in the whole manifestation. This is one of the reasons why it was an observation of the attendants of Sri Aurobindo, but also of something which Sri Aurobindo mentions in passing in one of his letters. He writes that he had made it a rule in his life never to ask anybody anything. If he needed something done, well, either he would do it himself or he would wait until somebody else did it, but he would not ask. Now this rule he made while he was still in Baroda, where the yoga had begun, but not really reached any great height as we see later. But already in his consciousness, this principle had begun to work because it related to the Aishwarya, which later developed completely, in which there was no more any need to ask. So something needs to be done, and he would look, Champaklal would catch his eye and know exactly what to do. Or even if he did not look, somebody would get the idea, it would be done. So again you find in Record of Yoga many examples like this, where he is not only spontaneously influencing the circumstances, but also receiving impressions of what's happening in what is described as Trikala Drishti, the vision of the past, present and future in one continuum. And occasionally he would have this image which would come. I don't remember the time, but it was something like 4:10. And he would see the person doing the thing at that time. Clock needed to be corrected, and he would see the person doing it at that point, and he would watch to see what would actually happen. And that was part of his testing of the perfection of the Siddhi itself. But you see here how in this context the Siddhi would become spontaneous. There is no occult means required. And by union with the divine possessor also of the world nature. According to our idea of these possibilities will be the solution we shall attempt to realize. Now once we have understood these two levels of soul-nature relationships, how we conceive of that relationship will determine the solution that we create. And now very quickly Sri Aurobindo will take us through the various possible relations, and you will see how at each step from the various possibilities the different religious systems or beliefs are justified. And it will become so obvious that it will be clear to us where we stand. So first he explains what happens when we are involved in mind. Involved in mind, possessed by the ordinary phenomenon of mental thought, sensation, emotion, reception of the vital and physical impacts of the world, and mechanical reaction to them, the soul is subject to nature. So this is our normal starting point. And let's quickly look at the nuances of it. Possessed by the ordinary phenomenon of mental thought, meaning you never really chose to think with your mind. It has possessed you. When did you ever think, or when did you ever decide, now I will start thinking? It just happened. How did it happen? You can say, well, in childhood I used to think. Who did it? Well, it just happened. In later childhood, in later teenage, I was trained to think more deeply. Not really. The faculty kicked in, and then the circumstances offered a more rich exploration of the faculty. Why did the faculty kick in at that point? That's how it was. If you take an ape, you can assist it in training so far, the mind, but not more. And others which are not even capable of that much training. Why? Because that's their nature. Why did we begin to think? That was our nature. So the first thing here he is describing is possessed by the ordinary phenomenon of mental thought, sensation, emotion. Meaning this is how it is in nature's working in us, and it possesses us, it defines us. We made no effort, really speaking, to make any significant improvement in it, except in little small things. When I found, for example, that when I was not making enough effort to make my mind clear, I would make silly mistakes in my work, so I make that a little bit of extra effort to be clear and attentive when I am doing this critical work. But that's about all. The nature itself has set the boundary and that functioning. What is it consisting of? Mental thought, sensation, emotion. I'm living in these domains. What is missing here is the part of the consciousness that can step back from these things, discover a greater freedom from which it can act on these things. What is missing is the part of the consciousness which is above mind, where it knows by intuition or lives in a consciousness with faculties beyond the mind's intellect's capability. These are missing. So this is the ordinary phenomenon of mental thought, sensation, emotion. Sensations are what determine most of my thoughts, interestingly. Look at the normal human being in a normal routine of life. Where are your thoughts? You're not sitting most of the day thinking of what is your purpose in life or thinking about what is the divine will wanting to do here. You're touched by sensations. I'm thirsty. I need to drink. I'm hungry, I have to eat. I'm upset, I need to say this to him. You have a series of sensations hitting you and your responses to them, and the emotions which arise from the sensations. And then in your work in the world, reception of the vital and physical impacts of the world and mechanical reaction to them. 99.9, maybe more, % of our day, everything we do is in a reaction to the impact coming from the world. And the reaction is mechanical. When I actually drink water, I have taken the sip, but at no point was I conscious in my hand to hold consciously, to take it, uncover consciously, to sip and taste consciously. While I am sitting with friends talking, or I am eating my lunch, my mind is somewhere else, this is going on mechanically. Observe carefully from morning through to evening. How many moments are there when you actually snap out of this half-sleep somnambulism, which is made of reactions, and snap out of it and say, what went wrong? What did I do wrong? And you make effort to correct it. Once you've made effort to correct it and now it's back, your mind again plops into its old habit, mechanical, instinctive living. Can we change it? And this would be the beginning of yoga. When you begin to observe these things, but also consciously having observed, shift consciously. Turn your thoughts in a different direction. Turn your emotions in different directions. Give different value to the sensations. Observe the physical impacts of the world and the vital impacts, and not react mechanically. Hold back the mechanical reaction and then choose a conscious reaction. Just this exercise will begin to change everything. Immediately you will find that half the problems of our life are created because of our mechanical, instinctive reactions. And the moment you hold back, hold it as a formula, stop, think and act. Mother gives you this as a formula. Step back and then act. So you step back, okay, I was about to say something, hold. And that fraction of a moment of stepping back, you notice half the time you don't need to say anything. Thing is getting resolved in any case. And when you need to say, you didn't need to say so much, it was enough to say just that little bit. And suddenly everything becomes much simpler. And this is a basic practice we should build, we should have been taught in our teenage. But even now, wherever we are in our life journey, it is something worth doing. Step back, pause, consciously act, whatever the action is. So the first breaking away will be from here, and then we will discover a greater freedom of the soul. But as long as we are in the mechanical reaction, he says, the soul is subject to nature. If you go to a normal space, go into the marketplace, observe people, shopkeeper, buyer, go to or see in movies, the stock market, where people are shouting, screaming for catching those few seconds of advantage of shifts in stock prices. Observe these most energetic, dynamic activities, and you will find entirely, almost 100% is driven by instinctive mechanical reactions. A new person entering this space is making slight effort now to learn, to absorb those patterns. And once he is seasoned, it has become mechanical, now it's happening. And it's not a criticism of whether it's good or bad. Some of the best good people are still living mechanically. And some of the worst bad people may be doing consciously. It's not a measure of goodness or badness. It's just mechanical or not mechanical. In animals, similarly, you can see complex behavior patterns, again bound in the mechanical. To the extent that this is true, certain religions which claim animals do not have a soul are justified if they use by definition the term soul to be the self-aware, self-observing sense of freedom of consciousness. Yes, most animals don't have it. By that reference, most human beings don't live by it. So they are as good as animals if we use that definition. But it's only in that moment when we stand back we become human truly. So this is involved in the mind and possessed by the ordinary phenomenon. The soul is subject to nature. And what is the degree of this subjection? Even its will and intelligence are determined by its mental nature. Determined even more largely by the mental nature of its environment, which acts upon subtly as well as overtly and overcomes the individual mentality. Now this description, so briefly placed, opens us to a whole domain of exploration, and will touch upon many facets of it, and on your own perhaps you can dwell upon what are the further implications of it. So first he says, will and intelligence, its will and intelligence as this mental thought and phenomenon of ordinary consciousness, its will and intelligence are determined by its mental nature. How I choose to act, even when I'm saying I'm choosing consciously, is determined by my nature. So let's take somebody who is used to doing good, known for doing good, and someone who is known to be selfish and etc. Given a choice, you can exactly predict what the person will do. The good man will do his usual good and be proud of it. The other fellow, selfish guy, will follow his selfish instinct and be proud of it. What makes this person good and the other person selfish or bad by any moral standard? They didn't choose to be like that. They grew into that mold. From childhood we saw that tendency in this boy. He was naturally generous and helpful. From childhood we saw this fellow to be scheming, calculating and trying to take more than he gives. It was just there. Or we will say this imprint of the tendency developed because he grew up in this environment where everybody was like that. And he acquired that imprint, and now that is him. So this is the point he makes. First, that it is determined by mental nature, determined even more largely by the mental nature of its environment, which acts upon subtly as well as overtly and overcomes the individual mentality. If your environment is around you different from your mentality, there's an influence. There are two levels of influence, the subtle and then the overt. The subtle is even more powerful, Sri Aurobindo explains elsewhere, precisely because you are not conscious of it. And it works from inside, seeps in and changes you until it overcomes the individual mentality. Now what happens? The individual mentality begins to behave like the environmental mentality. And if it stays in it long enough, it acquires that tendency even after it goes away. But at least when it comes into this environment, it acquires this character. Now the examples are too numerous, but we will touch upon a few. I'll try to make them as diverse as possible. You go into a place which is dirty, and you will find you will automatically tend to follow those patterns of behavior. You go into a place which is clean, you will tend to follow the pattern of maintaining cleanliness. Now this is obvious if you see Indian trains, where sometimes people have the habit of spitting also. If the corner where somebody has already spit and it's not been cleaned, you will find everybody goes there to spit. You want to throw dirt from your house, and if there is no proper waste bin, where do you go? You look for the dirtiest location where someone has already put and it has stayed there. Well, you will go and put it there, isn't it? The same people now in a clean train, perfectly clean. In Bengal, for example, for many years, they were very proud of their the metro in Calcutta. You could go to any other train, the usual spit and dirt and waste thrown around would be there. But if you went to the metro, it would be perfectly clean, and for years together, decades together. Why? Because somehow they were proud of this space and maintained it because that was the environment created. The same people we have seen changing behavior instantly. You go to a military complex, spick and span, you will find people have just taken a toffee, they will not throw the waste, they will look for a waste bin. Why? You've created a mental atmosphere of discipline and sensitivity to cleanliness. The same person outside that space behaves differently. I met once with somebody in the Navy in Vishakhapatnam. He was an officer in the Navy, in the submarine division, so they spend months literally underwater in a group, congested space and so on. And he was showing me around, and at some point, because he knew I was coming from the ashram, the interest turned to spiritual things. And then he said, all those things, meaning spiritual things, they are to me so distant because I am living this life. But every time that I go back, and he came interestingly from the Himalayan regions. He said, every time I go back, as my car is driving up, or the bus is driving up the hill, as I go up the hill and I go higher and higher, all the spiritual things come back, and I live with the conscious awareness of the presence of the gods on the peaks of the Himalayas. And then he says, when I start driving back, as I come to the plains, all that fades away, and I am now in this very normal mind. Interesting. He's conscious of it, but helpless. You see why people are so happy when they go high up in the mountains, because there is no clutter of thought forms. Suddenly your mind is relieved, you feel free and de-stressed in your thought. And the same person enters the city where there's this extremely ugly, suffocating thought formations and clutter of junk, far worse than the physical dirt that you might find. And it is overwhelming. Your mind begins to follow those patterns of haste, fear, confusion, action, need to do this, need to do that, and jumping around. And the same person pulled out and taken into a space where there are not enough people, high up in the mountains generally, away from the cities. Oh, this feels so nice, it's so relaxing, my mind feels de-stressed. The thing you didn't realize is, it had to do also with your environment. If you enter different city spaces, you can feel what the culture of mind of that space is like. Within city spaces, you can have subspaces where you enter and your thought pattern changes. Within those, from room to room, you can find there are shifts. You can, for example, enter a college campus and you can straight away say, is this academically strong, or is it just people whiling away their time, having fun to get a degree and get out? You can feel the difference, because here you feel the thoughts of clarity, of deep thought. Here you feel only the emotional clutter and junk, and the difference is known. It impacts you subliminally, and that's the part which is the most effective, because it shapes you instantly. There is also the overt influence. People around me, well, they believe these things, they talk like that, they live by those values, and so I need to conform, and I make an effort to conform. The effort you make is always a struggle, because your nature and your intention are separate. But what crept in happens automatically. So these are some examples. I'll give you other examples, and this has to do with things which we are not conscious of in the design of certain environments. Once this is understood, this principle is captured, you can consciously apply it. Advertising does this. The industry of business or design, interior decoration, does this intentionally. So for example, you enter a fast food restaurant, the colors are bright, yellow, red, intended to excite. So it increases and amplifies your sense of hunger. Before I entered it, I was not too hungry, but because my friends were hungry, we stopped. Now I enter it, the smells hit me, and the colors hit me, and suddenly all my senses perk. I think I'm going to eat also. Second thing you notice, the music and the pace of the music is fast. It's called fast food for a reason. They want you to eat quickly and go out so that the next lot can come in. You go to a different space, a 5-star hotel, where they will charge you 10 times or 20 times more. They want you to sit back and enjoy. And the music is slow, soft, soothing. An hour passes and you realize, oh my God, where did the time go? And it's designed with that intention, the lights and everything. Now, if you understand this principle, you can see how far the whole process could be taken. How far it can be taken even in a moment's influence. You are reading a magazine or a newspaper, you turn the page to skip over an advertisement. And so the advertiser has barely 2 or 3 seconds. Can he catch your attention and influence you? And there's a whole science around how this is done. And you'll notice, strangely enough, when you get deep into the science, that there is a lot of this subliminal programming. For example, you can take any advertisement of alcohol. Look carefully at the bottle. Look at the play of light and shadow which is used, and it's all deliberately done. Look at the play of light and shadow, and if you look carefully, you will find very clear symbols of women or of certain things which for you would be exciting. Freudian symbols which would stimulate the instinct of desire. There are experiments which are done where this picture and the other picture are shown. The difference is a slight tilt. In one the image is there, in the other it's not. None of them are noticeable consciously. And automatically people prefer the picture where these things are subliminally put. There's a flow of water in a glass. In the play of the water, there are these images. You would never notice it consciously. You have to actually look for them. And yet in the very act of flipping the page, it had an effect and it changes something. It is amazing to see how deeply these influences can be formed, to what extent they can be molded. There are examples which are demonstrated on television where the doctor speaks to the person, suggests a few words at the level of suggestion only, and then tells the person, now you draw freely a picture. The person draws a picture, and then the doctor shows you a picture he had already taken. You can see all the common elements present. If you go back to the conversation they had, nothing consciously was present of the elements of that picture, but things which were suggestive of those were present. In other words, there was a thought formation which was built up in the conversation. The thought formation had content which was saturating your mind, and when you decided to draw a picture, it manifested itself. Now the extent to which this control goes is so amazing. Literally, we come to the conclusion that we are like puppets who can be played and our behavior molded. Now remember, if this can be done with a single advertisement that comes to you on a page or on television, what can it do to an entire nation when you have a headline which is going to be seen by a million people who read the same newspaper or watch the same television channel? And the implications of that. Imagine when you're watching a mass show, like a live football match or some award ceremony, where 1 billion people are watching live, and you have the intermission of advertising, or a drama or a dance program shown in between 2 activities of the football match, and the suggestions thrown in at that moment and the deep impact they have. And it is an area worth exploring to see simply the kind of suggestions put up. They often are intended to hit the lowest common denominator, the lowest human basal instincts, precisely because we are most vulnerable, because they are automatic there. So this point is so important of how the environment acts and overcomes individual mentality. Now these are all in the normal life. I want to take a few examples from the spiritual domain, and this will be more interesting for us practically. When you enter a space such as Auroville, the same principle applies. From the point you enter the perimeter of Auroville, there's a shift in consciousness. The mother observes how, when she was coming by boat towards Pondicherry, she felt suddenly the presence change, and she knew she was in Sri Aurobindo's physical aura. And I think she mentions 10 nautical miles away. She knew she was in Sri Aurobindo's aura. Now, this is something which some of us have experienced at times when we have traveled outside Pondicherry and you come back. And it happened to me once. I was half asleep in the car, and then suddenly there was the familiar sense of being close to the ashram. I woke up, opened my eyes, looked at the watch, looked at the environment, asked the driver, how far are we from Pondicherry? It was about 10 kilometers. And it was interesting, the shift was so dramatic. Literally, I woke up closer to Sri Aurobindo Ashram, the main center of the Samadhi. In the evening especially, when there are less people, you can walk down from 2 or 3 blocks of the marketplace. As you approach, you can feel a layer by layer as if the atmosphere is becoming more dense, more palpable, if you're familiar with that vibes of that space. Or similarly, when you approach the Matri Mandir, you enter the perimeter of the Matri Mandir space, you have entered a different zone. And your thought patterns shift. Notice how that happens without any conscious effort on your part. And similarly, layers as you cross them. All depends on what has been built up at the center and how far it radiates. And this can be consciously built and should be consciously built. Now what will happen is, people entering that space spontaneously will find their thoughts moving towards higher values. Remembering the divine, feeling closeness with the divine presence, or suddenly things relating to the aspiration now become more concrete than things relating to my personal petty desires. The same person moves out of that space, and now suddenly the personal petty desires begin to come forward. Sometimes the transition may take a day or 2 or 3. You moved out, gradually those things fade, and now you feel yourself invaded by the city, culture and values of that place. Again, depending on which city, if you go to Bombay, it will have a very strong sense of financial interests, whereas when you go to another city which is more culturally based, it will have a different environment, and it will shape the people who live there and their priorities. So for us, it is extremely important that we should consciously cultivate the space, and the protection of the space is critical. You cannot say, we will create, this is the domain space which is Auroville in consciousness, but we can allow these small patches to come in because we didn't buy the land in time, and now some developer has come and created a mall or whatever it is, with values which are contrary. Then you have allowed an invasion and an infection. 2 things may happen. Either it's like a little knot of a tumor that has crept inside the body and is continuing to seed negative or perverted influence and making the rest of the body sick. Or if the collective consciousness is strong enough, a kind of a barrier forms protecting from that space and isolating its influence. But it means there is always a pressure or a struggle. This is the reason why Mother defined Auroville from its center and then the perimeter around. The master plan itself having 2 layers, one which is the obvious layer and then the influence, which also needs to be protected. Ideally, you must have multiple layers so that the most intense part is protected by something less intense, which is protected by something less intense, which then plugs into the normal space. You cannot have an intense consciousness with a normal space immediately next to it. It will mean automatically the creation of an intermediate layer which will push apart and narrow down the intense space. Now, all of this is extremely important. It means here there is always a struggle of influence between individual and the environmental space. And if a large number of individuals have an interest in rush, they bring their collective environment which can infect or damage the one already created. And I go back to another incident, which is when Golkund was being built. It was begun, I believe, 1936. Mother wanted to create something which would be a first in the world New consciousness, new forms. Well, all the way. So first in the world, Golkund was the first modern designed building which was environmentally conscious and the climate was self-created, so to say. Meaning it was cooling, self-cooling and things like that. Now this required the best designer, the best architect, best engineers and best money. Imagine at a time when the ashram is struggling with finances, the mother's guideline to the architect was, cost is not a concern. Crazy, isn't it? But remember, she was working for the world. So, cost is not a concern. And then, the design was set and the engineering was going through. Again, mother intervened even to help there. Just because a slight diversion, the chief engineer of the ashram, he narrated this, how they had a problem, the architect had made a design, but they could not set pillars in a way that the load could be balanced. So they couldn't solve the problem. And they went to the mother and said, we have a problem, we can't solve this. Mother said, bring me the drawing. So she saw the engineering drawing, put a mark and said, put a pillar here. So these guys go back, they do their engineering calculations and now everything is solved. So this chief engineer, of course it's years of study that he has and his intellectual superiority of knowledge is suddenly put to shame. He goes to the mother and says, Mother, how did you know? You have not studied engineering. And she says, oh, I just saw and it was obvious. That was the way the intuition works. But all of that, the building itself was to be finished within 6 months. But it needed, I believe now I'm unclear about the number, 500 workers to be there. Sri Aurobindo said no. Such a large number of people coming so close to the ashram would harm the atmosphere which has been prepared. Not more than, I believe it was 50 people. And as a result, the whole thing took almost 10 years to finish. And they had to accept that as a compromise. Because more than 50 people, the labor coming with all their values, all the emotions, and often some of the crudest. You see, the cheapest labor is often the lowest grade in terms of consciousness, having often the most crude life or vices. They are the cheapest available. These people would come there with their junk. Of course, they would be under influence of what is built up, but they would bring their thing as a group also and push back, creating a dilution and a confusion in the atmosphere of the ashram community. Now remember, this is when Sri Aurobindo and the mother are in the physical body and holding most densely that atmosphere. And if you understand that they could not allow that compromise, you understand why it is so necessary to protect the physical integrity of a spiritual community. And this is so important. And this you have to now see in the context of the things happening in terms of land and the attempt to create highways and other inroads. And why Mother insisted on getting the land first, even before you make the buildings. And the same thing in the context of the ashram, where all the buildings around the ashram used to be rented or owned by the ashram. And then somewhere along the way in the late 80s, the trustees decided to lose the buildings, just give it up. And shifted the bulk of the ashramites to one of the gardens far away. And immediately there was this invasion and dilution and all the rest which followed. And the damage is done. You can never go back. With property, with land, you can never go back. And it's done. And all of these are of immense consequence when we are speaking of a spirituality which embraces and transforms life. If the spirituality was for withdrawal, not so important. Even then you want a mental space in which your withdrawal can survive and not be under constant invasion of contrary thoughts. That's why the monastics go away from the cities. They don't like the city thought invading and spoiling their purity. But if here the reverse is to be true, we want to bring that purity into life and manifest something, it's so important to protect the space and the layers around it. So, maybe I've digressed, but this principle is so important. He says, even its will and intelligence are determined by its mental nature, determined even more largely by the mental nature of its environment, which acts upon subtly as well as overtly and overcomes the individual mentality. And this is the reason why the need for communities, for a spirituality which wants to transform life. And the reason why the Mother allowed and encouraged centers all over the world. If you're sitting alone in your space, you cannot manifest with any reasonable stability or completeness. You need to have a community support in which the protective environment is built up. Even if you're not living in the same space, at least having a center where you meet to share and nurture, to strengthen that consciousness. It is critical to build that environment. But now we recognize the importance of how we are influenced. I will touch upon one more factor which has deep spiritual implications, but it starts with an occult insight. You see, a lot of people have demonstrated occult powers. Telepathy, psychokinesis, some form of mind reading, some form of influence on matter, being able to move objects, heat objects or sense objects, remote viewing, etc. In the laboratory, often they falter. While having near 100% success in their own home or their clinic or whatever space they are normally working in, when they are brought into the laboratory, suddenly things become somehow less spontaneous, more difficult, higher failure rate. And this insight I got from one of the greatest modern psychics by the name of Ingo Swann. Reading his work, when he was first taken into the laboratory, he could sense the impact of other people's thoughts and the laboratory environment itself having a strong sense of cynicism. And he found it affected his ability, very interestingly. And so the team that he built up subsequently, they were taught that when you help somebody to develop these abilities or experience them in the lab or in the military, as was the objective then, you have to create a protective environment in which the faith is accepting of those possibilities. Now you see what's happening. When the psychic, who is fully capable normally, is brought into a space which has a contrary faith, he is an individual in an environment, and the environment quickly overwhelms his faith. He knows it's possible, but somehow at that moment, slight doubt, slight hesitation, and the principle behind these things is the deep faith is often the great force. You shake that, falter that, and it breaks. There used to be a great debunker by the name of James Randi. I don't know if you've ever heard his name. He was very popular for a while. He claimed to debunk anybody. He would go into these spaces where these people were tested to be working. He would come in and start making jokes, fool around, and suddenly all the powers would fail. And now we understand why. Because he brought the negative faith. He brought the contrary power to neutralize this spontaneous emergence of a deeper, more sensitive truth. Now, why is this important spiritually? Ingo Swann explains this very clearly. In The Play of Power, he explains the moment you enter a space that belongs to another, you have innately accepted to be in a receptive position to his energy, power, or dominance of that space. It may not be a person, it may be an institution also. But innately you have accepted in the very act of entering, and that has precedence over your own. And from a spiritual perspective, an occult perspective, it's so obvious, but from a spiritual perspective, this is so important. We accept to be in the space that belongs to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, for example. The fact that you enter into a space owned by them changes everything within you. But if now the space is redefined, it's no more owned by Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, but belongs to X, Y, Z human figures, and you enter that space, it has a different effect. Who has greater power? Well, this. And its limited value, its limited standards, etc. that has a greater power over you. These things are extremely important in the way we value our relationship with that space. never have the illusion or the wrong idea that Auroville is under Government of India, UNESCO, UN, board, governing board, advisory board. None of these are real. They are all apparatuses, devices created for the work of the space to be in an environment which is built of machines and governments and bureaucracy. You are just feeding the bureaucratic requirement so that this can be what it is. The space belongs to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo. It is their presence which owns, possesses, and to whom we owe allegiance. This relationship is critical. And we must hold consciously this relationship, not only individually, but collectively. And it is in this relationship that the gift of the spiritual manifestation and the possibilities that Auroville is meant to manifest will happen spontaneously, and we will say miraculously. The moment you replace them by some other authorities, you are subject to them, you have accepted their authority, and their limitations and perversions will begin to dominate and rule what happens here. And this is extremely important. In your mind, you must throw out that. So when, in the example I took of Ingo Swann, he would enter those spaces, he would ask to take responsibility. He would tell the people, no, you don't decide what I do, I will decide what I do. And they had to agree. Then he would seize the space, so to say, and the power. And then what he came with the values and the faiths and the reality that he represented, that would function more clearly. You understand why this is so important? We have to consciously invoke and place the authority in the hands of the divine. And then only the action of the divine will be able to act through its direct action, which we call miracle. Well, this is true not only of the community as a whole, it is true within the communities within Auroville and within your home and within your house and within your body and within your mind. The principle is still the same. So, think about this, because this is something extremely valuable and important as an insight. Consciously rebuild your relationship of the ownership of your mind, of your life energies, even of your body, and of your home and your space and your community. At least as far as the spiritual space is concerned. And then you will have the benefit of this principle, that the environment will assist and help you rather than opposing and contradict and weakening your faith and strength. So, I reread this line. Even as will and intelligence are determined by its mental nature, determined even more largely by the mental nature of its environment, which acts upon subtly as well as overtly and overcomes the individual mentality. Thus, its attempt to regulate, to control, to determine its own experience and action is pursued by an element of illusion. Since when it thinks it is acting, it is really nature that is acting and determining all it thinks, wills, and does. So the moment now we realize that we are actually molded by the environment around us, the sense of illusion becomes inevitable, because finally it's that which does this. Even when I'm thinking, when I'm acting, when I'm choosing to act by a will, which seems to be a conscious choice, it's actually the environment which is influencing me. You see how this works? Often you will find you're going to a meeting, there's a very strong influence in the group for a certain direction, you end up agreeing with everybody, you come away and you say, oh, but why did I agree? I had gone with a very different idea. The group energy overwhelmed you. I've heard this from so many people. They went to do the right thing, they got in and somehow they couldn't, their mind was clouded, they lost it. They lost their clarity. Or momentarily it seemed like the wrong thing was the right thing. And later they come out and they realize it's not so. And so you realize you actually don't have a real free will. You don't have a real free thought or free action. It's always the environment and nature finally. Not just your little nature, but the larger nature which determines the little nature. And the sense of illusion, the element of illusion is there. That means my sense that I am conscious and free is illusory. And this is inevitable if you look only at this band of experience. If there were not, so it is really nature that is acting and determining all it thinks, wills and does. And what nature has done, she has created pockets of spaces where the thinking, willing and acting is different in different spaces. So you go to a laid back sea beach resort, your thinking, willing, acting becomes laid back sea beach resort behavior. You go to a mall, it is molded this way. But entire cities, entire countries, entire cultures nature has made with certain imprints, entire planets. And there's a very deep insight we have here. The earth as a planet is a special focus for nature. You will remember Mother's observation that it is a special center in the whole universe. Now it's very convenient for us to think, we always want to be the center of the world, and so it's nice to think like that. No, when Mother says it, it's not trivial. And she explains why. She says this is the one planet on which the principle of individual psychic evolution is being worked upon. Now imagine if you go to all other billions and billions of planets which have life, and often human-like life. They do not have the individualized psychic as their prime driver. They often have a group consciousness or a collective individuality similar to bees or ants. And so they have very easily some sense of harmony in their collective life because we feel very closely networked as in a strong joint family, but no individuality overwhelming the collective identity. But they look at Earth and say, my God, what a strange experience. Each person is a world in himself. What does it feel like? Now, if they want to experience that, they can't do it in their planet. They have to actually take birth on Earth. Because this is the focal point of environment in which this particular kind of evolution is being developed. And it's a strange experience of adaptation for them. I diverted to this for a very important reason. But we move on. So this being the case, we realize nature thinks, wills and does in us in wherever we are. And so where is this real sense of freedom? And then he gives you another insight of what protects the freedom. If there were not this constant knowledge in it, that it exists in itself, is not the body or life but something other which at least receives and accepts the cosmic experience, if it does not determine it, it would be compelled in the end to suppose that nature is all and the soul an illusion. Now, there's a saving grace which is preventing us. But if that saving grace is removed, what's happening? Well, everything is product of nature and soul is an illusion. This is the conclusion modern materialism affirms, and to that nihilistic Buddhism arrived. You see, in Buddhism when they say no soul, no God, it comes from this recognition. Finally, everything is happening from conditionalities of chains of cause and effect. So particularly in the nihilistic Buddhist, which is different from the larger tradition of the Mahayana, but in the nihilistic tradition, this becomes very important, that everything finally has to be decomposed into causes and conditions. Now these are two terms you will find in English used often in Buddhist teaching. Whenever you have a problem, you are suffering, step back, observe the causes and conditions. So causes are the things which led to these results, cause and effect, chain of karma. I did this, therefore today I am suffering now. Conditions are a pattern which make for something to emerge easily or something else to emerge. So if you create a condition in which people will want to lie, then of course you will have more lying. You create an office culture in which everybody is questioned and put to doubt. We have to sign on 3 forms, get permission from 3 people because nobody trusts you. In such an office condition, you will automatically find the impulse to steal increasing, strangely. This is actually part of research experimented. In an office you create in which people are trusted, people will want to live up to the trust. And theft will drop, honesty will increase. Conditions. You create a condition which leads to the emergence of tendencies or directions of tendencies. So causes and conditions is what everything boils down to. So now when we have a dialogue with, let's say, a nihilistic Buddhist group, and we want to speak of oneness, they can't accept an underlying consciousness of oneness. Because that would mean supposing either a soul or a divine or some reality which is not part of this process. So they have a different way of accepting oneness. They look at the totality of all causes and conditions, and that is the underlying oneness which gives rise to all phenomena. You see, it's a way of stepping back to an idea which is closer to the sense of divinity, but not quite it, but which still holds the overall sense of cause and effect. So we are part of the causality and chain of cause and effect of oneness which gives rise to our individual separateness. But that's the oneness which holds it all together. But useful. And materialism similarly comes very close to this, particularly modern materialism. And which is the reason why you'll find in the most strong materialistic societies of today, Buddhism has a very strong hold as a religion, as a tradition which opens to spirituality, because it's so close in its overall conclusions and yet offers a way out from the coarseness and crudeness of the material life. But all this would be a natural conclusion if there were not something which is saving grace. What is that? He uses this phrase. He doesn't use the word saving grace, but what is the saving grace here? If there were not this constant knowledge in it that it exists in itself, is not the body or life, but something other. So somewhere within us, even though it seems like everything is a product of working of nature, we have this constant knowledge. You can't get rid of it because the nature of the knowledge is your identity. You can ignore it, but it's always there. I know that I exist. It is, simply. And science tells me, no, you are just a bundle of electrical signals formed in your brain which gives you the illusion that you exist as an awareness. And you say, yes, that makes sense, but it's not my experience. My experience is I exist. And so Descartes' famous statement, I think, therefore I am, because his existence was tied to his thought. And so you find here it exists in itself, not as a product of something else, is not the body or life, because I can disengage from the body, disengage from my life and still observe it. But I still find I am thought. The sense of closeness to thought is very strong, and so I think, therefore I exist would be a conclusion. Unless you have trained yourself to stop your thought, then you can stop thought and say, I exist even when I am not thinking. And you would conclude, because I exist, therefore I can think, therefore I can live, therefore I can sense and enjoy this world. So here comes this last part where he says, which at least receives and accepts the cosmic experience if it does not determine it. We have the sense that I am choosing to accept, or upon me is a registration of whatever is happening in the universe. If somehow this awareness vanished, there would be nothing on which the registration would take place. Body in itself is not registering. Emotions in themselves are not registering as an experience, isn't it? There has to be this I am conscious in which the registration is taking place. Now, all of this fine distinction is very important, because when we look at solutions to the problem, we will see the importance of this. So this is the conclusion modern materialism affirms, and to that nihilistic Buddhism arrived. The Sankhyas, now this is a different approach to the solution. The Sankhyas, perceiving the dilemma, solved it by saying that the soul in fact only mirrors nature's determinations and itself determines nothing. So this is that center which says, I am registering all these things which are happening to me. The weather, the thoughts, the emotions, the sensations, the relationships, everything happening, including what's happening inside my body-mind complex. I am conscious is registering on me. I am conscious of it happening. But the Sankhya says, yes, but you're only reflecting what's happening. You are not affected by it. You are like a mirror on which the image reflects. It seems like the mirror is of the same image, but no, the mirror never changed. So the Sankhya solved the problem by saying that the soul in fact mirrors nature's determinations. Itself determines nothing. I didn't choose to do it. Nature did it. I felt it reflecting in me, but I am not it. And then there's a choice. But can, it is not Lord, he says, is not the Lord, but can, by refusing to mirror them, fall back into eternal immobility and peace. So I am registering the anger, the disturbance, the confusion, the clarity, and the fluctuations. And at some point I can say, I don't care. I will cease to register. Let it rise, let it fall. I will not care. I cease to pay attention, cease to give value, and turn away from it. What happens then? The reflections cease to happen. And then it's as if the world begins to fade out. The practices such as Vipassana are intended to develop this. They make you focus obsessively, persistently on the sensations of the body, on the rise of emotions, on the rise of thought, simply observing, separating, not identifying, until you reach this point where you have a choice to refuse to mirror. And then what happens? When you refuse, you fall back on your innate nature, which is eternal immobility and peace. And I am simply aware in eternal immobility and peace. Similar result would also be acquired in certain practices of Buddhism when this, by a similar process, step back to become just in stillness. There are other solutions, he points to. We'll go through those quickly because that will complete the discussion. There are the other solutions which arrive at the same practical conclusion, but from the other end. The spiritual, affirming nature as an illusion, or both soul and nature as impermanent, and pointing us to a state beyond, in which their duality has no existence. Either by the extinction of both in something permanent and ineffable, or at least by the exclusion of the active principle altogether. Now, in this one sentence, he has shown actually 3 or 4 different traditions. We quickly look at the variations. So the conclusion is pretty much the same. There is this stillness and immobility, and then there is the activity, which fails when you settle on the stillness and immobility. For the integral yoga, we will have something different, which will be very different. We will actually find the soul as master of nature, and the two finding unity in a higher, greater expression. But right now we're just taking this position. So first, from the spiritual side, you say this is true, and the nature therefore is illusory. Somehow there is this imaging that's taking place like a cinema, light playing on the screen, but the screen never changed. Switch off the light, screen is permanent. You cannot switch off screen. Or ignore the light until it ceases to be. And this is in fact the experience we have when in extreme concentration, you just stop bothering, stop registering the fluctuations of the world, see them as impermanent, not real, not lasting, until suddenly there's a kind of a transition where the only thing permanent is this awareness. Against this awareness, all this not only is impermanent, becomes ephemeral, unreal, dreamlike, fades away until it becomes an illusion and subsides. World ceases to exist in your silence, in which you can lose yourself. So as an illusion, nature is illusion, or both soul and nature are impermanent. Even my responses and my awareness in responding are part of an impermanence. So here it's not seeing the pure mirror, it sees the soul as an active player which is impermanent in nature. And so you have to rise to something higher, which is permanent. In that permanence, neither of these exists. So point to that, get to that. But what is the nature of that permanence? Immobile peace, again. So either you drop this off, you extinguish this, or you exclude it and find freedom by removing this, ignoring it. Of course, if you open your eyes and step out of your cave, the world hits you again. But internally you can hold that poise and allow the hitting to take place until eventually when your body drops, then the world ceases to hit you. But you are still in the subtle body, which also you can drop, and that's part of the world ceases to hit you until you absorb entirely into that. This would be another solution. Though, problem with all these solutions, they do not satisfy humanity's larger hope and deep-seated impulse and aspiration. These are valid solutions so far as they go. So you can accept any of these, they work. But they don't satisfy somewhere these two things. Humanity's larger hope and humanity's deep-seated impulse and aspiration. What is humanity's larger hope? Somehow we can make a better world. Should be possible, isn't it? That's what everybody promised. The religions promised it earlier, as far as we can go back in our memory. Christianity said, we will create the ideal society. Islam said, turn the whole world into Islam and we will have an ideal God's society. Then they failed. Then science came and offered the same promise. We will, with a reason and logic and technology, make everybody comfortable and happy, and we will all live together happily. Always this idea that somehow we need to make this a better place. And this is the larger hope that it's actually possible and within our lifetime. And the deep-seated impulse and aspiration goes further. I want a happiness that lasts. You can give me the technology and the comfort and the entertainment, but somewhere I can imagine that something is missing. All your conceptions of utopia, look at all the conceptions in cinema, in novels, in your own mind conceive of an utopia. Everybody is good, everybody is nice, everybody is helping each other. And then after a while, boring. Where is the newness? Where is the excitement? Where is the breakthrough? Where is the overcoming of challenges? Something is missing, right? But can you have everybody happy and nice and kind to each other and yet have that challenge of overcoming? And it's difficult to conceive of it without having some element of friction or conflict. But maybe yes, I can. But when you actually start doing it, everything in your nature somehow seems not to align or fails or enters in contradiction with others. If only everybody in the world did exactly as I think they should, then we would have harmony. But that's what each one is thinking. So the sense of something, deep-seated impulse and aspiration, but something more, I can actually sense it, but it's even beyond my capacity to conceive, beyond my imagination. And if you have to give it terms, you will find yourself falling back to religious traditions, some divine bliss, some divine beauty, some divine wisdom and knowledge, everything becoming suddenly beautifully sacred and somehow full of this wonder and joy and awe-inspiring feeling. I can sense it's possible, but I cannot imagine it in my mind's picturing or in my life's forms. But I sense everything points to it. In nature, when I see this extreme beauty and joy, it points to that. And my mind's ideals point to that, but can't quite grasp it. That's why he uses this phrase, deep-seated impulse and aspiration, but we don't have a form. So larger hope is obvious forms we have, and then deep-seated impulse point to something greater. These are not satisfied by these solutions of withdrawal and silence or extinction or whatever. But now we can see why those solutions came and from where they come. From the sense that you are totally conditioned by your nature, or totally conditioned by the larger nature which conditions your nature, which conditions you, and you really don't have any ultimate sense of freedom or power or lordship. And this would be the conclusion. But they do not satisfy humanity's larger hope and deep-seated impulse, for they arrive at an absolute in itself, or at the separate absolute of the soul, even if they reject the many rapturous infinities of the absolute, which the true possession of nature by the soul in its divine existence offers to the eternal seeker in man. And so this is what they are losing out. The many rapturous infinities of the absolute. Instead, they aim at the absolute in itself. And here we have to recognize what is this idea. You see, when you think of an absolute, you're thinking of something towards which everything points, and somehow it breaks out of space and time into something indescribable and unimaginable. That's absolute with a capital A. In itself. But in other commentaries, Sri Aurobindo observes, absolute in itself is not the whole of the absolute. The true absolute includes all these relativities which are its own expression, which live in the absolute, which are a part or an aspect of the absolute. The pure absolute in itself is an abstraction. But the absolute in its completeness holds all these infinite possibilities in which it knows itself as absolute. And that's the beauty of it. And so the delight and the raptures of its infinity are available in all these infinities in its relativities. And so this idea we will find Sri Aurobindo pointing to in his commentary on the Kena Upanishad. From our ordinary life, there is the absolute which is transcending everything, but in between there is the absolute as it reveals itself in its relativities. And each these relativities are infinite and full of the rapture and the delight of the absolute. And so these solutions which we have just looked at, they fail us because they aim at the absolute in itself, missing out all this in between. Or they arrive at the separate absolute of the soul. The soul separates itself and becomes absolute, and all this then becomes not an expression of the absolute. And so they reject many rapturous infinities of the absolute, which would have come if the soul had true possession of nature in its divine existence. And this is what is offered to the eternal seeker in man in this relationship of the soul possessing in nature in its divine existence. And this makes a perfect ending for the paragraph. Having seen the limitations of this approach, now he moves to the next idea, that the soul thus in its divine relationship with nature has a different experience. And the next paragraph, we will just read the first line. Uplifted into the spirit, the soul is no longer subject to nature. It is above this mental activity. It may be above it in detached aloofness, seated above and indifferent, or attracted by and lost in the absorbing peace or bliss of itself. Or it may also find itself, and we will see later, Lord, participant, enjoyer, inhabitant, etc. Fully engaged with in that relationship of nature where it is free, no longer subject, but also Lord. But now remember, the key difference is this. Living in the mental activity, you are subject. Rising above mental activity, you are free. But it's you. You taking two different stations. You rising or falling, so to say, between these two states of consciousness. Obviously now the solution is simple. We need to be able to rise out of the mental activity in which we are habitually embedded. And increasingly as we are able to rise, we recover our true sense of freedom. And then from that freedom we can turn upon nature and establish a new relationship. So all that will be part of the discussion later. But he says, uplifted into the spirit, that would be the status where the freedom is complete. But every degree of the rising will give us greater and greater freedom. So this, we pause here and continue next Friday. Looking back, you see the justification for all these traditions. Why they were important, from what experience or mind they emerged. And because they emerged from a real experience, they had to be fully developed and even as methods perfected so that we could draw the best from that part of the human experience. Their limitation being accepted, we can now go beyond them. But initially they served a purpose to help humanity to break free as a first step. And then another step, and then another step. And then now we see the full picture, and so we can rise rapidly through these levels. It means in practice that each of these levels is a temporary status we might have to go through. To be able to step back from nature and find yourself aloof from it is a necessary step before you can ascend in consciousness. To be able to recognize the illusoriness and transitoriness of nature and even your lower individual soul is a necessary step in that poise of freedom, to create a clear separation. And then later you reverse the relationship from a poise of complete freedom to re-embrace and reshape. But these are steps one has to pass through, even in the practice of the integral yoga. Each of these steps, remember, had to be imprinted on humanity. A person doing conscious yoga can pass through these steps in a few years. But when you imprint on a humanity which is in an unconscious yoga, they take a few centuries to pass through each of these. And therefore the necessity to develop an entire religion, culture, belief system, etc., in which humanity is, so to say, groomed and developed to make these steps. And again it becomes complex because certain parts of earth have this, other parts have different form and variation, but all of them have to allow for those humanity which are not even ready for this. So you have a series of, so to say, steps of different traditions, religions, cultures, civilizations, taking up these truths, developing, embedding them in the collective space as a large, slow, unconscious evolution of humanity. And within them, individuals or small groups of individuals aiming much higher, developing and preparing for the more rapid, direct, conscious, spiritual evolution or yoga. So we have a very rich picture, and we can pause here for any comments or questions.
You mentioned how Sri Aurobindo was dealing with pain by not only stepping back from it, but also changing the sensation. And can you then point out what the mother's approach to it was, whether it was building upon that? Because she said somewhere that she could not do that because her work was forced to ignore it, or I don't know.
Actually, there was no difference between Sri Aurobindo's experience and the mother's. Whatever Sri Aurobindo has described in the record of yoga, the mother also went through similar experiences, some of which she has made reference to in her early notes on the way, but already by that time it was a much larger experience. Some of these are recorded in her prayers and meditations, where she is connecting to earth nature itself and not just a question of her body. But what she spoke of, which is particularly recorded in the agenda, is that she is not allowed to find escape from the struggle or the pain in the body consciousness. That would have been easy to escape from it, but she had to face it and deal with it inside in the transformation of the cells. Now remember, the cellular transformation is a different from what we earlier discussed as the body consciousness itself. When the body consciousness is changed, already its registration of sensations is different. But the cellular transformation involved entering the cellular consciousness, which is even lower, very close to the inconscient. And there, awakening the cells and rising out of the cellular habit in all of not just human, but all of life evolution on earth. And so there it was a much more difficult task, which was only possible because she had brought into the whole operation the supramental consciousness as the prime influence. So the way it works is you cannot change things of the lower grades of consciousness unless you have access to a power which is equally greater. With your mind you can push an influence, but in order to change that fundamentally you need a greater power. And you will find Sri Aurobindo makes allusion to this. When it comes to the physical consciousness, only the supramental consciousness has the power to overcome the rigidity of matter, of the material. And when she went into the cellular consciousness, it was that grade of rigidity and resistance that she was working with. So, yes, she had to face the pain, which was also part of that cellular body consciousness. But long before that, she had already attained to her body consciousness having a different response to the world. And that was already there. This was a different level of working and a different line of perfection, which was given to her to complete. When the choice had to be made between Sri Aurobindo and the mother, one of them had to leave to make for the link from above, to bring down the supramental. Sri Aurobindo said to her that her body was not only younger, it was more plastic. And it was to her that this work therefore was given.
I'm living in Orville, and I went one day, I was felt like 2 days I want to stay in ashram, and I was hearing so much about Golkan. My mother was present, she was visiting, and hearing about that. I went for Golkan one morning and asking that I would like to stay for 2 days and have experience in ashram. And I'm living in a family life, but I want to be connected with the ashram because mother.
Yes.
Place where the body and where the Aurobindo is the soul. So for me to have experience when talking to the beautiful lady and explaining that I am coming from Aurobindo, I want to stay here. And suddenly she was looking at me, she said, this place was made for only sadhak. It's not for you. And I was like shocked and what it means for sadhak and how they could identify with seeing the person whether he is a sadhak or she is not sadhak. I said, okay. And then they allowed me, at least I asked her, can I see the room? Because I was really was touched with this place and I want to just see, even though I'm not staying here, going to stay here. Then when she showed the room and I was like staying for a few minutes in the first room, I was glad the present and I felt I was staying there. And I said, thank you mom, I see. But then on the way I come to Aurobindo, then I felt mother has given such a beautiful place here. Then why I'm searching for myself to see somewhere else? I'm very happy here. So I should follow my sadhana here. Then just it's a beautiful to share with you.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. Thank you. It's unfortunate sometimes, problems are always with people who have small minds and one has to discount it. But I'm glad you were able to feel that space. Yes. Mother created it, remember, as a model. All buildings of the ashram should have been made along that model. That was not done later. But it doesn't mean as a model you replicate the exact form of it, but the principle of it has to be replicated. And the atmosphere which you experienced, that is also exceptional. In the detail that we went into about the question of the influence and the need to protect the space, I mentioned in passing of the current tendencies for real estate developers to get into Auroville and damage its integrity, and also of the recent effort of the highway to cut through the eastern portion of Auroville. And maybe I spent more time on this idea because today especially it is something which we all need to become conscious of. And if all of us can align in thought, in prayer, and in the ideal and vision of what Auroville is to manifest, then it will help immensely for the efforts being made to protect the boundary and the sacred space that is Auroville. But it needs to be done consciously by everybody. And so perhaps now as we close with the Om together, we can hold our intention for this purpose, so that those who are working on the field to protect the integrity of Auroville will also be assisted through our prayer, invoking Mother's intervention for this purpose.